So it's my pleasure to introduce Wangoma Shayawikon, or The Kiss of the First Snow, which is a story that John Nicholas wrote. And again, just highlighting the fact that this is a collaborative effort between myself, Ella, and John. It gives me the opportunity to, as a historian, to work with the language, because I think that there's the language, culture, and history of the Munsee people are so much entwined that you can't just separate them, as much as oftentimes you're working with one more than the other. So this story gave me the opportunity to focus on improving my language skills, and gave me a reason to say no to other work. Well, sorry, a very passive no to other work from the community. But maybe I'll ask John or Ella to step in just to talk a little bit about, when the story first started, or their experiences with the work as a team.
Ella, do you want to go ahead and say something here?
Sure. So I'm the one who illustrated the story. About a year and a half ago, maybe 2 years ago, I was contacted by Ian. But him and John have been working on the story quite a few years, I think, before that. So all the illustrations are my doing. Yeah, I can go into more of that if you want, but I used watercolor and then I scanned it digitally. So what you'll see now would be like the digital copies of the watercolor. I picked watercolor because I personally enjoy watercolor, and I felt like at the time it's what I was best at. And after reading the story, I felt like the material fit better than doing something digital, something a bit more hands-on, not as something that was a bit more personal, I guess. So yeah. John, if you wanted to go.
No, just to say that this is my first opportunity to meet Ella, and I want to thank you for your contribution. I think your illustration adds so much to the spirit of the story. So thank you, Nishi.
And thank you for letting me be a part of your story.
So as Ella mentioned, that the timeline has sort of been inclusive of sort of the last 5 years in terms of translating the story. So I had the pleasure to meet John during our online Lenape language classes that my good friend Karen Moscow ran via Zoom during the pandemic. And I made the mistake of mentioning that I was translating some of the stories from my extended family, the Logan family. And John mentioned that he might have a story that I would want to translate. And I think I've mentioned before in this public space that I was kind of expecting a one-page story at most, but the story was in excess of 10 pages typed. And for a second language learner and speaker such as myself, that's a fairly daunting task. Whether you're asking me to translate that into Munsee, or whether you're asking me to translate into a different language, that I realized was going to take me some time. So I accepted the offer, and it took me about 2 years to translate that, in between, being a father, being a parent, working a full-time job and things like that, and other, community needs. So I worked diligently on that for a couple of years with the translation. And as Ella mentioned, that she came in about 2023 to offer the visuals of that. So she had to work with me at a distance as well, because I live in Barrie, which is 3 hours away from where Ella is, and I live thousands of kilometers away from where John lives. So we're all working at a distance. We're not actually on the community working together. This is also somewhat of a challenge because Munsee-Delaware does not have any first language speakers. We have people who are very active and interested in the language, but we're a community of second language learners. So there's not that support network for people to support in terms of talking the story out loud. In 2024, we reached out to Learning Bird, and Karen always asked me, so we should really be sort of outsourcing some of the work that we just can't get to because we were always so busy. And so I finally took her up on her offer, albeit after she passed, to work with this company called Learning Bird, which is very active within Canada, working with Indigenous languages. So they support Indigenous communities with bringing their languages to either recording, to provide the visuals, but to do that film work and documentation that I don't have the time, and we may not have those abilities in the community. And then finally, we wanted to make sure that the story was brought to the community in 2025. So it was introduced back in December of 2025 at Munsee-Delaware Nation. So Ella was there. John zoomed in from the Netherlands. We also had Vanessa, who's on the call tonight, teach us some quill work, and among other people, my sister, my cousin, we were all there to offer up our sort of research updates to the community in terms of what we've been finding out in terms of wampum, the big house, and other things that are important to Munsee-Delaware. So that's sort of the timeline compressed. I could give you the minute by minute of me sitting in my basement with my cat, trying to translate and going between different sources to try and take the words that are on the paper and put them into the language. But what I think is most important is that what we're doing is we're trying to take things that are in English and bring them back into the language in whatever way we can as second language speakers and learners. Next slide, please. And there's a beautiful picture of us all with our smiling faces. Again, that was in December for our sort of our year-end get together for story night, our story weekend, I guess I should say, but also our history update. Next slide, please. You're missing the big TV that's at the front here. So John was able to zoom in and check out the action from a distance as well. So I shared this, I think, last year, but I thought I'd share it again in terms of the translation process for those who are interested in language learning and sort of my process when faced with a 10-page story. Most of what I apply is things that I've had to learn in elementary and secondary school. My parents believed in language learning, so much so that my parents forced me to take grade 13 French all the way through. I was a terrible language student. I tried my best, but there was absolutely no way I was going to be considered a fluent bilingual English-French person in Canada. But language always interested me. And so hearing the language when I was a kid living at Munsee, and then coming back to it as a young adult, I sort of applied the same techniques that I witnessed my mother as an ESL teacher do when she was teaching English as a second language out at Base Borden. So part of the translation process was working with the nouns. The nouns are the simple thing for me, right? Whether I'm translating it from English to French in my job, but those are things that I look for because they're easy wins. And then I move on to the subjects and the verbs, and then I try to piece together that because they're more difficult, right? They're going to take some time. I highlighted John's work, so I printed it all off and essentially laid out in front of me, and I highlighted sentences that were going to be a challenge, because in English we tend to be very wordy, and we have a different structure in terms of our sentences. There's things that we probably wouldn't say in the Munsee language. And so synonyms became my best friend. So looking up on the internet for synonyms for words in English that might be close in Munsee or have a workaround. I always thought of it as a workaround. So that's something that I chose to do in terms of the translations. I did have to rewrite pieces in English, but I tried to stay true to the story because the story is the most important piece. That's something that John created, and I didn't want to deviate too much. So that was part of the process as well. And as Kristin mentioned, there's some support materials involved. So that would include the O'Meara Dictionary, Goddard's work, Goddard, and then of course the Ministry of Education documents that are printed here in Ontario. It's a wonderful document. It's as old as the hills, but it's on my shelf and it's a good piece. And again, I think it's the piece that I'm learning, maybe as I approach well over middle age now, is that it's a marathon and it's not a race. So if you get frustrated, you kind of put it to one side and then you come back to it again. I don't think I would have had that patience if I were in my 20s or 30s. It was like, oh, I got to get it done. I got to get it done. But you know what? It takes time, and it's important. And I think that only comes with being, having matured a little bit, I guess, over my years to understand that you do need a break sometimes when you're doing the translation work. Next slide, please. The voice that you'll hear is mine. I apologize for that. There's a couple of thoughts that go through my head every time that I record something in the language. One, listening to Kristin, I just love the stamina of listening to her speak, because she can go through the entire story and she has the stamina to keep going with every sentence that she does, every page that she read earlier. I don't have that stamina. I need a break. So you're going to hear a lot of breaks in the recording, because as a speaker, I'm also going back and having to re-record. And it was all done off of an iPhone, right? So I didn't have a professional speaking studio or anything like that. They didn't send me a microphone. But they judged that the iPhone, the voice messaging would work just fine. But because I don't have the stamina of other speakers, I had to record them in sentence blocks and then go back and re-record if I put the wrong inflection on the wrong double vowel. So it got me thinking about what if we could go back in time and hear the tone and intonation of a real speaker, like back 200 years ago? What would it sound like? And I can't answer that, but it does get me thinking, going, I'm listening to me and I sound monotone, but I'm sure it wasn't like that, right? And I think about other languages and how the tone flows and there's this beautiful sound to it. And I'm going, man, you don't have that. But it does get me thinking as a speaker and a learner. I know I shouldn't be doing this, but I apply colonial problem solving. I shouldn't be doing that to an Indigenous language. Sadly, that's the public school system in me, right? That's what I was taught. So I tend to apply it when I do language work. It's going to take me a lifetime to leave that. But I also believe that there are some language strategies that are valuable that I learned along the way. There's considerations to it, less so as you get older. I think you start to leave this behind, but for young people, there's the considerations of being shy and anxious, fearing judgment when you speak the language or when you try and translate the language. And it's that freedom to go against the rules, I think, as you get older or you get to more mature, or you get to, your shoulders get a little bit thicker, where you go, you know what, I'm just going to do this because, that's the only way I'm going to learn, right? If I make a mistake, then that's fine, but I got to try my best. There is that historical trauma of being and speaking that I want to acknowledge. So the intergenerational issues where our language was not allowed in schools, right, actively. So I do want to acknowledge that piece. And I always come back to this: if you speak your language, if you're actively trying to learn it, read it, hear it, and work in the language, I always consider it a strength. And if you're doing that, it's also a political strength, and people will view it as political, that it's a strength that that you're trying your very best. And I approach that with my own family. So my kids are not fluent; they'll pick up the language, but I think I'm doing a better job than what my parents did or what my mom was able to do for me. So within each generation, the exposure to language, the exposure back to the Munsee history and the culture, I think as the next generation after me is going to do a way better job because they've had that exposure. I'm going to say I've got some progress as a writer and speaker. I wish that I could do it full time. That's just simply not possible at this stage in my life. Hopefully when I retire, I'll be able to devote more time to the language. And I think that would be much more helpful for my progress. But I have a responsibility to family. I have a responsibility to the community and sort of working in other fields, as mentioned, with history and culture, that can drag you away from language at different times when maybe you should be, put your nose in the language dictionary. But that comes with, responsibility for other needs. Well, So these are my thoughts about the process that John and Ella and I undertook. I loved the fact that we were able to collaborate. So I got to meet a new friend in John, a new friend in Ella, people I hadn't actually known or met before. I met Ella and John in language, but I never met them before that because we're all members of at large, we're off reserve members. And to be honest with you, it felt like old times when I was working with my colleague Karen. Right. And Karen was a friend where I could speak language, I could text language, we could work on things together. And since she passed, it was, you're sort of like you're floating on your own. But this story sort of brought me back where I had the opportunity to work with the language again. I could hear Karen's voice behind me or on my shoulder while I was doing things. But I got to actively collaborate with two other community members. The whole goal is to share these stories as well. So whether it's my own family stories that we've translated in the past, the goal is to share them with the community at large, and that we have a repository of stories to share and to teach and bolster our language program at Munsee-Delaware. It got me thinking about my role with the Munsee language, and as I mentioned, I tend to get pulled in different directions willingly. It's not against my will, but what's my end goal with the Munsee language in terms of myself? What am I going to do to improve my own skills? The documentation piece is ongoing and it won't stop for us as a community. We're also thinking about protocol in terms of story sharing and when to share a story and when we can share those stories. And that's that piece of ultimate the responsibility that we have when it comes to if John's going to share a story with me, we go through a process where we're all well informed and we're all understanding of what the end goal is for the story. So those are just some of the thoughts about the process. I know I've shared those in the past and some things are a bit new. Maybe what I'll do is I'll share the future work. Yeah, that's fine, Ray, you can go to that slide. That's the slide. So the future work probably for this fall at Princeton or in the 5th annual Munsee-Delaware Story Night will be, and many have probably already seen this a bit, but there's a future story that involves my great uncle Arnold, who fought in World War I. It is a fiction nonfiction story. Because John's story taught me a lot about translating, the English version of this story will actually be completed first. While I go back and translate into the Munsee language. It's going to be, Learning Bird is currently doing the film work in and around the metropolis of St. Thomas in southwestern Ontario, Munsee-Delaware Nation, and other places where Arnold lived, to try and provide that audio visual of sort of following him on his way to France in 1914. Catherine Shupik Hall is doing the visual work. So we anticipate, if I can get my butt in gear and write the last 2 diary entries for August 2025, that will be the first version. And then we hope to release it in the month of Remembrance in November of 2025. So that's our future piece that's in the works right now. What I'm going to do is, because I've talked quite a bit, I'm going to open it up to John and to Ella to make sure I didn't forget anything before we show clips.
No, just a few words. It's really been a pleasure to work with Ian and with Ella to have them or help them tell the story that I had written some time ago. What is there any particular point that you want me to address, Ian, in our having worked together?
No, just your ultimate patience with me, John.
No, it's been a pleasure. It really has.
And just as a preface that with everybody who's online tonight, there are 2 versions that you will see. The Munsee version will be shown first. And again, it's a clip. It's about a 2.5-minute clip, beginning, middle of the story. So it gives you a taste of a taster of the story. I'll be quiet.
Lawate
and Aahaasuwi, Chechpanakwasowat, waak Pashikitali, Lawate, Iesqua Nikitakwat, Atmombila, waak Mashilat Machine, waak Shuk Quishquat, Kshachan Esh La Wanipakwa. Lunaapeewak Weekawak, Shuk Mata Hweli wak NEEKAAWA Chechpanakwasowat, Alawi wak Kishquik. Al NEEKAAWA Wetasamewak, Awayayusak Asand wak Akihet Kopinang, NEEKAAWA Hweli Hanisawak. Ngwitan Lauchipalendum, Mata Wasikan, wak Mata Niipaahum Pastak, Elya Mata Pishkak. Wema Awayayusak, Wingawalasowak. Kishok Yani Wasalachin wak Yani Aluma, Huakalawi. Shuksakalawit wak Pishiktalu, Wema Wen Kishawalomwa Tokila Lapi wak Mata Chechpanakwasit. Ashkishkwik wak Chlak Wulak. Shuk El Hweluk Wanakat, Wika Chechpanakwasowat Awat. NEEKAAWA Pakinimak, wak Kteekhiikeew, NEEKAAWA maawehleewak. Awen at Lunaape waawehleewak laachumohkawaatwak. NEEKAAWA maawehleewak kteekhiikeew. Awen KIHTAACHIIMUWAK, NEEKAAWA litaahewak aki, aanihkwaachiimuwak laachumohkawaatwak iasqua, naxpii mata wawitak, kanj natachit. NEEKAAWA laachumohkawaatwak naxpii KIHTAACHIIMUWAK. Ash awayayusak maawehleewak KIHTAACHIIMUWAK. Dit wunj Lunaapeewak luno shinzoklekiken, alum shihat shaya hwat KIHTAACHIIMUWAK. Wunj neeka KIHTAACHIIMUWAK milan malakonset dalton. Ngwitan KIHTAACHIIMUWAK pakit maawehleewak. It was 10:30 in the evening on Christmas Eve in the tiny house on the Indian reservation. Long ago, when the world was young, it was a very different and much more beautiful place. It was a time long before noisy cars and airplanes, and the only rush you heard was the sound of the wind as it rustled through the leaves in the trees. Human beings lived in this world, but there were not many of them, and they were very different than they are today. Because they lived so close to the animals, rocks, and plants of the forest, they had learned their many languages and could speak with them. One day, a most horrid thing happened. The sun did not set, and the moon did not rise. Because of this, there was no nighttime. At first, all the creatures enjoyed themselves. The sun always shined, and the sky was almost always clear and blue. But as time went on, and as beautiful as it was, the creatures found it pretty tiresome to wake up time after time in a world that never changed. Each day was bright as the day before, but because the days never altered, the task of survival became more difficult. As their boredom and hardships increased, the creatures began to mutter. Someone must have done something to have so upset Creator to bring about this change. Of course, each creature blamed the other. Beyond the question of who was to blame, they began to wonder how or whether the world would ever be the same as it had always been. With this uncertainty came a great sense of fear in the world. It was finally decided that there should be a grand council to discuss the matter. Each form of creature was permitted to send one of their kind to attend the great council.
So it was that, from among humankind, a man named Glakikon was sent to the first Grand Council of Creation. It is from him that this story was passed down through generations. The time came when the council finally met.
So you get a sort of a sense of the story, both the Munsee version and the English. I was remiss to say that I messed up on the English version quite a bit too, despite it being my first language, because you're reading someone else's story, and sometimes you get a little bit ahead of yourself or you miss a word where normally that wouldn't be an issue, but when you're actually recording a story, it makes all the difference. So having to go back and correct myself in English was also another task. I wanted to start the story with that first image where you're looking down at the path, because that's one of my favorite paintings that Ella did. So much so that I've got a version of that hanging in a frame in my office because it reminds me of the story, and it really does highlight that story really nicely. So, but I'll offer the floor to John or Ella.
I don't have anything really to add in particular, unless there are any questions from an author's standpoint that someone might have.
I would ask.
Okay.
Sorry, go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I was just gonna ask about I can't remember the exact word about the first human or the human representative in the story, and that name and that translation. If you could maybe speak to how where that came from in your storytelling.
Yeah, the name Glikakan came to me from other stories that I had heard as a child growing up. My father was Munsee-Delaware Nation, and some of our in-laws were Chippewa of the Thames. And Glikakan was a hero from some of the old stories that had been passed down through the Chippewa. And so I wanted to honor them by including him in the story.
What if I could add on to that question? John, the story is your story. It's a story you put together and shared with Ian, but it's also reflecting your family stories. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how those two things kind of come together. They're sort of two sides almost of the story in a way.
Well, I can speak to that from the standpoint of having grown up. I've referred to my years growing up. Of course, that was many, many years ago from now. But there was a certain time of year, as most of you will know, when there weren't a lot of things to do outside. So that became the principal time of the year where storytelling was most important time of the year. Some of the stories that we heard were simply for entertaining value to kind of keep us kids. We didn't have TV, we didn't have movies to go to, but we had storytelling. And other stories, most of them really, were an attempt to try to teach through storytelling life lessons that each of us would have to hold on to as we grew up. And one of the things in this story that I was trying to convey was that, as I started at the outset saying that one of the most important things that we have is our understanding or knowledge of our selves and our worth as a link in the chain of life. Well, John in this story is kind of going through that with the loss of his mother. And it's important for him to understand, and he comes to realize that as the story unfolds, that his mother hasn't lost as long as he keeps her close. And it's that principle or life lesson that I was hoping to convey through the story, that we're all connected. Those who went before, those who are now, and those who are yet to come.